Hello, everybody. We are going to be working on Unit 6 this evening, and in Unit 6, we are going into one of our web bonus chapters for this book, which is chapter number 37. The topic for chapter 37 is servlets. And servlets is one of the three web technologies that we are looking at in order for being able to write Java code that will propagate or push output content to a web browser. It is a very important technology. It is used by many professional developers. I'm not sure to what degree the popularity is of servlets relative to Java server faces. I do know that Oracle, as kind of the propagator of Java, really prefers at this point in time that Java server faces should be our preferred technology. What I have seen, frankly, out in the workplace, though, or from other people I know that develop Java code, is that they tend to stick with JSP, which is the oldest of the web formats and the last one we're going to look at. And when we get to it, I think you'll see why some people stick with it, and partially because many of the people that code for it come from backgrounds like many of us web developers, where we intermingle languages, for example, like PHP, where you can intermingle your Java and PHP code on the same page. And that's how JSP works. Servlets and Java server faces work a little bit differently, as we've already seen with Java server faces. That whole advent of that XHTML format, for example, is a pretty big thing in application development for the web. The one thing that they point out here right at the beginning of the chapter, it says that servlets are Java programs that run on a web server. And if you keep that in mind, that's pretty important. So we will be writing regular Java code in our servlets that will connect to our web pages and then feed information into them. It is strongly recommended by this author, and I agree that whenever you're doing like web output stuff, that you really want to be working with a proper IDE that can launch and propagate into a browser rather than working from a command line type interface, although it is possible, and I know some hardcore people that prefer to work that way, and if you do, hey, good for you. No judgment there. You're only poised to learn more taking that type of approach. Now, in terms of the way that we interact with applications like this, and this is true really of all the formats that we're using here, when you have a user that's sitting here at the web browser and they're interfacing with a web server, usually you're calling from the web server, you're attaching to an address or a page on that server, and you're saying, hey, web server, give me that page. Serve that page to me so I can read it in my browser. In some cases, it'll just read an HTML, CSS, and JavaScript file, read them from the file repository there, and just send them to you. And then your browser receives it and puts it up on the screen the best it can. In many cases, we do write full-blown applications here that have programming code embedded into them and then need to interface with systems on the back end. And the systems that we've had since the beginning for doing back-end programming on the web usually talk through what we call CGI, or Common Gateway Interface, where the back-end file system in some cases needs to pull code from the file system. And sometimes that code is written in languages where the code either needs to be live interpreted, which means just to run the code, or in some cases might need to run a program that's already compiled, like a Java program. Like Java programs don't just run like Python programs or JavaScript programs do. Java programs need to be compiled first. In other words, turned from code into an executable. And in this case, the file system can trigger and execute that program. And the CGI is really kind of a generic way of saying anything that runs on the back end that needs to be executed, that's already a binary, so already an executable program. And then that, whatever that program does, maybe the program just pulls in information from the database, or maybe that program does computation, or whatever it happens to be, will then intermix with the web content and then go back to the user. But it will happen on the web server host. The users are unaware of this stuff. And the beauty about back-end programming, you guys, which we did see the last couple of weeks, is that people do not see your programming logic that created whatever you're seeing on the screen. And that's true in languages like PHP. So you might write your PHP code, for example, And then when you run the page and it shows up in the browser and you right click and view source, you see just the HTML that was created as a result of the code running. You never see the code. Now, contrast that to a interpreted language like JavaScript, where you can see the code in the browser. They cannot hide it. And in some cases, that can present some sort of issues and concerns, not the least of which is people can look at your code and copy it if you have something really clever, but also in some cases might provide indicators to hackers and things of doorways into your systems on the back end. One of the reasons why we do back-end programming in the first place is really for code hiding or encapsulation, so people don't get to see that logic, they don't get to see the code, they don't get to see the vulnerabilities, they only get to see the results of the programs that are running. All right, so that hopefully clarifies things. Now, the interesting thing is that we are going to look at this thing called servlets, and servlets work in kind of what we think of is, it's almost like a containerized environment is really kind of a nice way to think of it, that the code executes in this container, and then once the code is executed, it gets combined with your HTML to go to the screen. Let's take a look at their first little example program here. And if I had significant time, like one more week, basically, I would just type this in and show you how it works. But let's take a look at the different approach here and compare this to how we do a traditional web page, for one thing. I want you to notice that with the servlet, we are writing Java code. So there's a package declaration, we have import statements, we have a public class. I want you to notice that that class extends HTTP servlet, which means HTTP servlet is a superclass that has a bunch of methods and functions and stuff in it that we utilize to make all this technology work. And so every servlet application, the Java code has to do an extension of that, just the same way we did with the application class when we were writing GUI programs. Now, here we are starting to write basically the what I would call the core of a servlet, which is the part that pushes the content back to the web page. And I want you to notice what we're doing here are pretty basic. First of all, we do have to be able to handle the request. In other words, what's the request? The request is your file system on your web server saying, hey, I need this code to run and give me a web page. And so you will have the parameters of what you're looking to run, and then what you're hoping to get as a response. And we also have to throw, and this little piece here always indicates that we have exception handling put in, because we are working with both this whole servlet architecture and superclass, and then we're also doing input and output relative to the web server itself. And anywhere where you're communicating with outside systems or pieces of software, you run the risk of having things fail, which could cause a program just to halt. And we never want that to happen. We want to handle the exception and allow it to move on, and maybe display an error message to say, hey, you got a problem, or let's keep moving. And that's really the key to those exception statements. Now, once you get into the actual core of this method here, you're going to see a couple of things. First thing you're going to see is that the response that we're sending out is being preset to come out as HTML. And so we are setting the content type, in essence, telling the browser, hey, we're sending back some HTML, okay, deal with it. Then the next thing that we do is we trigger some of the input-output mechanisms of Java right from the root libraries that basically put together a collection, really, I think of it as a collection of strings in my mind, and then allow us to output those statements. Now, interestingly, we are basically doing print lines here, just like we, you think of like your typical console program. But notice what we're print lining. We are print lining the structure of an HTML document in plain text inside the output statements. And so we can push that stuff out. And I want you to notice the names of these methods as you're kind of doing this. There's the do get method that is kind of the one that drives it all. So The next thing that we're going to do here is we're going to step through and create this little project here just to get a feel for creating it. And then we're going to work on the exercise to go with it. And so get your coding environments ready. I'm going to pause here in the recording for a moment, make sure everybody's okay, but everybody should get their NetBeans up and running, whatever other tools you need in the background, and be prepared to code along because it's helpful to kind of circumvent any issues that we have as we're doing it.